This is 9/11 Freefall.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to 9/11 Freefall. I'm Andy Steele, the host. Guest tonight is Tony Szamboti. He's back to talk about the latest news surrounding the ongoing call for a new investigation into the destruction of World Trade Center 7 on 9/11. He's also going to be talking about a presentation he gave at a university in New Jersey earlier on in the winter and some of the pressure that the university seemingly went under and the problems that arose from that. So this is a long interview. I'm going to be playing that for you in just a moment. Before I do, we're going to do what we do every week. We're going to take our 10 seconds of silence to remember the victims of 9/11, their families, and all the people who died in the wars that followed 9/11. We'll do that beginning now. And that's 10 seconds.
If we're in a free country, why are we afraid to just talk about an event that was the most traumatic event in our history? I originally believed the official story. I aggressively defended it. When I first started cracking open that little window that there could be possibly more to this story, I went through every emotion, just like probably a lot of you here who didn't originally believe it or consider it are going through. And I didn't want to believe it. I came up with every excuse not to believe it.
Any building that succumbs to fire, that collapses, starts usually with large gradual deformations, and the building will begin to fall over, not straight down through the path of what was the greatest resistance. These buildings exploded. We have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions.
We started walking down the stairs. We made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel. Molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry.
Yeah. Like lava.
Like lava.
Volcano. This is all direct evidence of explosive controlled demolition. Interesting thing is fire can't create any one of these, let alone all 10.
If the FDNY and other firefighters start speaking out about this is going to explode, and it's going to open a lot of people's eyes to what really happened. Make this a normal thing to talk about so that this will spread like wildfire. It's starting now. From speaking out and starting this website and meeting Richard and a lot of the other incredible people here tonight, I've also met some military intelligence officers that have taught me a lot. And I asked one of them, how do we win? We can't get through the media. We can't get through most of our friends and family because it's too scary to talk about. How do we do this? And he said, it's easier if you just shine the light. And he said, just come from a place of love and not fear. Shine the light.
The views expressed on this show by guests and the host on issues outside of the 9/11 controlled demolition evidence are the opinions of those individuals alone and do not necessarily reflect those of architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth.
Tony Szamboti is a mechanical engineer from the Philadelphia area with over 20 years of experience in the aerospace industry. He designs structures for aircraft, spacecraft, and support equipment. He's one of the experts featured in 9/11 Explosive Evidence Experts Speak Out. He's been on the show several times to talk about some of the things that he's discovered, not just about Building 7, but the Twin Towers, too. Tony, welcome back to 9/11 Freefall.
Thanks for having me, Andy. Glad to be here.
So, you are the guest presenter for this week's webinar at ae911truth.org. That's still in the future tense for us as we record this, even though by the time the audience is hearing this interview, it'll have already happened. And a lot of what you've been up to lately has to do with some things that you've discovered more things that you've discovered on top of what you've already come onto the show to talk about Building 7 and the investigation that was done. So I'm going to give you the floor. Some of this gets a little technical, so I'm going to ask the audience to pay close attention to what Tony is talking about. But Tony, just go ahead and give the context here for everyone and make your case.
Right. As many people are aware, we found that the NIST report omitted some pertinent structural features, which we've gone over in the last couple of years. They would be girder stiffeners. On the girder, they claimed it walked off its seat because the flange failed, and that wouldn't have been true if those stiffeners were included in their model. They also said that there were no these little beam stubs that are next to the beam that's closest to the north wall that would have stopped that beam from buckling like they said it would. But in addition to that, they said there were no shear studs on the girder that they say fell, and that would have stopped it from falling. There's also a problem with their analysis in that they claim that the girder expands, and because it's heated to 500 degrees while the beams are heated to 600, and if that girder was heated like that, it would have went up against column 79. There would have been a lot of friction. But in addition to that, that column has side plates. It's what they call a build-up column. It's an I section, or H section, I guess I should say, but it has 2-inch thick by 26-inch wide side plates that are then welded to the flanges of the H section. So you have what looks like a box beam with a web in the middle. If you took like an I-beam and then you welded plates on the sides that spanned, past each flange, top and bottom. If you looked at it horizontally, well, this is just put in the vertical. The girder would have been trapped behind the side plates, jut out past the flanges of the column, and this has been brought up a number of times. But what's been interesting in the last, I'd say, 4 months, is there was an analysis done by a group called ARUP, A-R-U-P, which is an engineering group for there was a lawsuit brought by Con Edison, the power station that was at the bottom of Building 7, and their insurance company, Aegis Insurance, against World Trade Center 7 Properties, Larry Silverstein, and Cantor Engineering for negligence. It was, I believe it was dismissed by the 2nd U.S. District Court in New York, and then they appealed, and it went to an appeals court in New York, the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals. This analysis was done for Con Ed and Aegis Insurance, trying to show negligence, and what they did was they did their own fire simulation, their own heat transfer, their own FEA, and then they took it from there and did an analysis to try to show the building would completely collapse. And in that analysis, they say they include the stiffeners. They also say there were 30 shear studs on that girder, and this swore there weren't. And they found evidence of it somehow. But that's in the court record. And they show in their finite element analysis that the girder does, in fact, moving to the west, get trapped behind this side plate. So it can't travel further. It gets trapped behind the side plate after like 3 or 4 inches of travel. The seat was 6 inches wide, so the web can never get anywhere near past the edge of the seat. And like I said, if it had the stiffeners on it, in this analysis, it could never come off. This doesn't show the analysis where it actually failed. They just claim it would fail. And the other thing is that's interesting in this ARUP analysis is that after they do the finite element model, they say in that model that the girder would have walked backwards, would have been pulled off its seat instead of pushed, because they couldn't push it with the stiffeners there and it being trapped behind that side plate. So it doesn't get pushed off to the west. They claim that it would have been pulled off to the east by the beam sagging quite a bit. Instead of pushing it, now they're sagging it. Sagging enough to pull it backward. Okay, so the next step was, once they say that that girder came off its seat somehow, the next guy in line was this fellow Nordenson, who's a professor at Princeton, and he tried to show that once that 45 by 53 foot section in the northeast corner of the building fell, that it would collapse the next floor down, and it would have been a cascade down to ground level. And this said from floor 13 to 5, but he's saying it would have been all the way to the ground. And he said that, of course, this concerns column 79 becoming unsupported laterally if you take away its girders that are supporting it. But I found in his analysis, in Nordenson's analysis, that he used a point load for the falling beam and girder assembly. And that is an infinite stiffness. That does not consider deflection of that beam and girder assembly. And I did a finite element analysis and found the natural frequency to be like somewhere around a half a hertz. It was 0.52 hertz. And in engineering, and mechanical and civil engineers should know this also, natural frequency of an item is equal to 1 over 2 pi times the square root of the stiffness over the mass. So if you know the natural frequency and you know the mass, you can find the stiffness. And then you go through some, they're basically equations we use with springs. The energy is 1/2 kx squared, K being the stiffness, and that can be equated to the potential energy of the falling mass. And then you finally end up with force, and force is equal to K times the deflection. So you want to find the deflection, and I did that, and the deflection is about 32 inches versus a point load, which isn't going to deflect at all. And you can say that the beam and girder assembly is going to hit the girder below, on the floor below, that was still intact, and break it loose. But it could only do that if it applies enough force. And he has that the upper floor that's falling hitting the lower floor like 10 to 12 inches from its seat at column 79. It takes, you can do the calculation, and he admitted to shear that seat requires 632,000 pounds of force. That's a 14-inch plate welded to those side plates of column 79, plus a 1-inch seat that's welded to column 79. So it's over 600,000 pounds of force. Well, with 32 inches of deflection, the floor area, the mass was somewhere around 46,000 pounds. So you need an amplified load, and the way the load is amplified is if there's very little deflection. It's a shock load. If you get a lot of deflection, it lowers the peak load. And in my analysis, it's somewhere around, in a conservative analysis, once you take into consideration the deflection, it's somewhere around 200,000 pounds. And that's giving the benefit of the doubt. So even given the benefit of the doubt, it's about 200,000 pounds is the most you could generate with that floor, and you need over 600,000. So you can't even break the next floor down, even if the girder did come off. And this is a very significant find, that he considered that upper section to be infinitely stiff, and it's not. It deflects significantly. So that's just another point. It seems like every time you do an analysis, the official story just crumbles. And this is another example of that.
Now, like I said, there may be some non-technical people out there trying to grasp some of this. So a lot of this depends on the deflection and its impact on that floor. Can you clarify what deflection is? What causes the deflection?
Well, if you can imagine, if you dropped a rubber ball on the pavement, it's going to deflect a certain amount. It's going to have less force than a rigid piece of steel the same size that you dropped on the pavement. You wouldn't expect the rubber ball to chip the pavement or the concrete. This steel would probably do that. And that's because it's applying more force. even if they weighed the same, because there wouldn't be any deflection or very little deflection in that solid small piece of steel. But when you get the pieces of steel that are 45 and 53 feet long, they're going to deflect quite a bit when they hit their corner. And you get about 30-some inches of deflection.
So how did they make, well, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Where did they make their mistake in the analysis? Where is the epicenter of the mistake?
Well, considering the stiffness of the upper section that's falling to be infinite, that's where they made the mistake. It's sort of like you would have it'd be like considering a rubber ball to be infinitely stiff. Well, it's not. Okay? That's sort of what they did. Whether it was sleight of hand or just an honest error, I don't know, but the reality is, the point people need to take away is they can't even if the girder came off, when that floor fell, it would not be able to break the next floor down loose. You would never have this cascade like they claim. It just wouldn't happen.
Well, it's interesting, too, that they're in the middle of this lawsuit, and I would assume that ARUP is in this position that they need to show the building failing in some way. They are not, as far as I know, considering controlled demolition as even a potential hypothesis, so it's not something they're going to try to factor in. So it just seems like, and this is speculating on my part, but just, that they may be looking for some way to make this building fail and make their case in this lawsuit without going into the possibility of there being a controlled demolition because of how this position has been marginalized despite overwhelming evidence that controlled demolition is what happened. So you may have some guy doing this analysis or group of people doing this analysis trying to make this work, trying to come up with a scenario in which the building collapses because that's what they're told happened, that's what they seemingly on that day saw happen, and they know that the end result has to still show this building coming apart in the manner that we watched it on video that day. I don't know. I mean, what do you think of what I just said?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think they stayed away from controlled demolition because they tried to stay within the confines of the official story, if you will, that it was a natural collapse, but they just tried to say it occurred because of negligence on the part of the owner and the designer. And the court ultimately found against that, although one judge did write a contrary opinion and saying, we should find out how it actually collapsed. He didn't think they proved the point in the case. So, obviously that means he didn't accept the NIST report either.
That's a great point to make, and something that maybe I did know, but I've forgotten it until you just reminded everyone of that. There was a judge who dissented from this, and I need to read his statement. I haven't yet, but that's a sign of hope right there. That's good news. Have you made any contact with the group of people or person who did the analysis that you've found this issue with?
I did try. Guy Nordenson, the professor from Princeton, I emailed him a couple times, told him who I was, and he didn't respond.
Well, that's interesting. It seems that this issue has an opposite effect on the scientific community. Usually, from what I know, the scientific community tries to defend their work, tries to talk to each other, tries to get at some kind of truth. But in this case, you find a flaw in the analysis. They just don't want to hear it.
So much at stake, I think that's why, if you find a flaw, short of getting it published, they're going to ignore you.
Well, there's also a lawsuit involved here, too.
Well, there was. It's
been
settled now. This was fairly recent that appeals court rendered their decision. It was December of 2014, I believe. So it wasn't all that long ago.
So have you considered, what have you considered in terms of publicizing this issue?
Well, we are going to publicize it, but, we just haven't, it's fairly new. It's only a couple months ago that, that I wrote it up. I just did a small PowerPoint. I'm actually going to bring it up at in the webinar tomorrow night, the 8911 Truth webinar. I did add a couple slides to my presentation. That I gave a presentation at the New Jersey Institute of Technologies back in November, and that's what I'm going to use for the webinar. But I added a couple slides on this because this was learned since then.
And I want us to talk about that New Jersey presentation. That's actually the other thing I wanted you to talk about tonight. And I want to get to that. But first, I just want to reiterate what Tony said. That webinar, it's still in the process of it's going to be put together tomorrow or performed tomorrow. But as you're listening to this on Thursday night, it's already happened, and it should be archived at ae911truth.org/webinars. You can also go to AE911Truth's YouTube page and view that as well. And as I say every week, if you are somebody that is passionate about this issue, if you know people, particularly people in the building trades industry, who will grasp on this, who are interested in why buildings fall down or why they shouldn't fall down in this case, then please send them the link to ae911truth.org/webinars to watch that. Send them to the other webinars that have taken place, the ones put on by Richard Gage, the one that was put on by Jonathan Cole last week. We got to get this in front of as many professionals as we can, because as you get this out in front of more people, you erase that taboo. That's going to be the first step towards undoing any kind of controversial lie that's being kept all throughout history, is to make it something that is good and open and something that people can feel comfortable talking about in front of their friends. And when you have discussions like this, and it's boiled down just to the basic science, that's how you get at truth. It takes it out of the realm of the TV pundits screaming at each other and calling each other names, and gets it down into measurable facts, measurable answers that you can come at using the same laws of physics and the same engineering principles that have made us progress as human beings and has made their civilization thrive. So please spread that around. Check out Tony's webinar. I'm going to be on there with him, of course, kind of help him move it along. So, get these in front of as many people as you can. Do you have any comment on that, Tony?
No, I fully agree with what you're saying, Andy. That's what has to be done.
Right, and I'm just stating common sense here. I'm just talking about physics and common sense every single week. The great thing about AE911 Truth is the fact that we just stick to the science. We make very reasonable arguments that are hard to argue with. Again, even if you think we're way off our rocker, if you think we're making a mistake somewhere, you should still stand by a new investigation just to address the questions that Tony's raising, that so many other people who have signed the petition at AE911Truth.org are raising. So please, even if you don't agree with us but still think there's unanswered questions, sign that petition, because you stand shoulder to shoulder with us. One more question about your new discovery. Is this something that you've considered reaching out again to the Department of Commerce Inspector General, adding that to the piles of correspondence that you and your team have had?
Well, we may. That's an option that maybe we should look at, Andy.
Yeah, that is, and a lot of this is still somewhat new. I wanted the audience to get the breaking news here on Freefall regarding this issue and have it explained. So we'll have more on this later on as more action happens and as we figure out what to do with this newly discovered piece of information. So good job for you and your team for discovering this. We're going to switch now, because you mentioned the presentation in New Jersey that took place it seems like not too long ago, but I guess it was back in the fall.
Right, November 11th. Veterans Day, actually, yeah.
Okay. So, essentially, I'm going to have you set the tone here. First of all, tell everybody what this event was and why you were invited to it.
Yeah, there's a former police officer turned lawyer. I guess he went to school to become a lawyer, named Dave Meiswinkle, who runs he's very passionate about 9/11. He's a mature person. He's in his 50s. And he has an organization called New Jersey Aware about 9/11, and he's tried to petition different prosecutors in the district attorneys in the different counties in New Jersey that lost people, because they would have jurisdiction. Anybody who lost somebody on 9/11 in those buildings would have jurisdiction if these weren't natural collapses, and and there could be a prosecution. He had an acquaintance or a friend who was a mathematics professor at New Jersey Institute of Technologies, a fellow by the name of Jay Kaproff. And I guess it was about 3 years ago now that Dave invited me up to Hightstown to give a talk at an outside cafe, like a tented type cafe. And Jay was there, and he had mentioned, I gave a talk on lack of deceleration of the towers, and he said, he was going to try to see if he could get me in the NJIT to talk. And nothing happened for a while, and then apparently there was a new provost, and he was amenable to doing that. And Jay contacted me, I guess, last June and said they were going to have something in October, and then the date got moved to November 11th. And I prepared a presentation, and I went up there on November 11th and gave the presentation. But, something happened. It was supposed to be taped by the university, and we would have had that tape. But AE 9/11 Truth wrote an article about this 3 weeks prior, and called that we were going to give a talk there. And it turns out, we learned a lesson out of that, because certain entities apparently, I believe they put pressure on the civil engineering department there and possibly higher up people in the university, because 3 days before the talk, word came down that there wasn't going to be any video. And it was pretty interesting. In fact, I was the main speaker, and the professor that had invited me told me we had to park in a certain parking lot, lot 7 or something like that, and I had a guard shack there, and it was right in front of the big student center, which had a couple what they call ballrooms. They're auditorium type rooms, which is where the talk was given. We stood on a portable stage. They could configure it different ways, and but anyway, when I went to go in the parking lot, my name wasn't on there, but this one fellow who is from New York City and frequents things like the JREF Forum and other places, and I won't mention his name specifically, but his name was on the parking manifest instead of my name. And I'm sure that came from us advertising the fact that we were going to do this, and the fact that they didn't film it. The university even, they had previously, a number of weeks before, like a month before, sent me a release, for filming it. So they were all ready to go, and it would have been high quality, and we didn't get that. That didn't happen, and it was called off. Filming the talk was called off just a few days before. So my instinct is that was because, certain people found out that we were going to do this, that we were going to be given that talk, and I believe behind the scenes applied pressure to officials at the university.
Tony, this might sound like a silly comparison, but I've often compared what we got to do to WWF wrestling. You watch that where the good guy's fighting the bad guy, but not only fighting the bad guy, he's fighting the bad guy's manager and his 7 buddies and the referee, and as all the rules don't apply, So in our case, we got to do the same thing. It's like all of the regular rules do not apply when it comes to this issue. There are so many other obstacles thrown down. It's almost like some kind of unseen villain is raining fire from the sky, metaphorically, on the 9/11 Truth movement as we try to do things that any other group, any other nonprofit championing an issue would be able to do pretty much carefree without much thought. I mean, there shouldn't be any problem if they're offering to tape it, you sign a release, with you going down there and having it taped. There shouldn't be any kind of complication that we would expect. Once the event was set, there should be no other thought about it. It is typical, it is common for nonprofits who have speakers, experts championing their cause to advertise where that person is going to be speaking. It's expected to be done. Even, there's several examples of this. It's just something that is standard practice, but this is something that 9/11 Truth has to worry about, particularly AE 9/11 Truth, because we got a lot of things we try to do. Not just us, but people affiliated with us. We had Wayne Costi and Mike Smith on the show during the summer. They went down to CEFI, and what CEFI stands for is out of my grasp at the moment.
Structural engineering. It was a structural engineering conference, and an American Society of Civil Engineers structural engineering conference, I think, in Miami. And they protested outside. They handed out leaflets on the failure of the towers, and the managers, I guess, of the convention were nervous about it, from what I understand. They did that in New York too, I believe, a number of months before.
Well, that's another one. That's not even the one I'm talking about. But yeah, that's another example there where they wouldn't let AE 9/11 Truth have a booth at this conference just to simply present our information. I mean, it's not like it's a bunch of anarchists going down there. Richard Gage looks as clean-shaven and professional as anybody else, But no, what I'm talking about is that they were going to go to this conference to present a paper.
Oh, that was over in France, yes.
Yeah, and they pulled it.
Bowed out, yeah.
Exactly.
Wouldn't let them speak, and they took away their slot only a short time before. Right.
It's absolutely ridiculous.
Somebody must have gotten to somebody. It sounds. I don't see how you parse it any other way. Somebody applied some kind of pressure and got them to renege on allowing them to speak. So really, it's a stifling of freedom of speech. If these allegations we're making could be refuted, then they'd be refuted, and there wouldn't be a case for us to make. But they're not refuting it. They're trying to stifle our ability to get the word out. And that's what was done at NJIT also.
Well, and see, that's an important point to make, because people who are on the other side are going to say, well, yeah, it's because your position is ridiculous, and of course they're not going to let you present. But that's not the case, because it's not like something where, if somebody was presenting a theory that the moon is made out of green cheese, they would, obviously the paper wouldn't pass any kind of peer review process. It wouldn't be accepted, and there wouldn't be plans made to have a person come and speak and present it and make their point. It would just be rejected outright. In these matters, these are things that move forward through the regular process. Everything is going fine. That means they're scientifically valid. That means that they're worthy of being discussed, debated, just like the other papers at this conference, or just like other presenters who go and speak at this New Jersey university. And then something happens. And I don't know what happens. I'm not going to speculate. But something happens along the way where people freeze up. Somebody gets nervous.
That's exactly the kind of thing that happened. And, I am speculating that there were phone calls made. I can't be so naive as to believe there weren't. And the same kind of thing with the conference that Wayne was going to speak at. And basically his discussion, I believe it was going to be along the lines of engineering ethics, and tying in the fact that the 9/11 situation, these building collapses, were not investigated properly, and that there's an ethical issue. And, lo and behold, like you said, everything was going along fine until right before the conference, and they decided not to let them speak. So, so when somebody needs to stifle your speaking, that means they don't have a case. It's not an argument to say it's just nonsense, like some, nincompoop on the internet might say. That's not an argument. These are technical arguments. There's been papers written. I was involved in a paper that was published on the International Journal of Protective Structures, and the peer reviewers were high-end people, and they agreed with what we said, that the reason for the collapse of the North Tower has not yet been discerned. That was our conclusion. And we showed why it hadn't been. We showed Zednik-Bazant's papers, which have been published in the Journal of Engineering Mechanics, the American Society of Engineers, Civil Engineers Journal, we showed where they were in serious error. And the Journal of Engineering Mechanics and the American Society of Civil Engineers in general, their journals have been very remiss. We've found numerous serious fatal flaw type errors. In fact, the papers, in my opinion, are insidious. I think this professor from Northwestern, Zednik-Bazant, is probably well known to anybody that studied this. I believe he put out a paper on September 13th purporting to show how the towers came down naturally, that there would have been a powerful jolt. When we measured the descent, there's no decrease in velocity. And finally, he tried to come out with a paper published in that same journal, Journal of Engineering Mechanics, trying to say, well, you wouldn't be able to see it. Well, and a Canadian professor and I went through his paper, and we found serious, not just a flaw, a complete fatal flaw that, when corrected, would give diametrically opposed results to what he was saying. He assumed the energy absorption capability of this column, a fictitious column, but he doesn't say it that way. He just says the column has this value, what they call a plastic moment, which will allow you to calculate the energy absorption. And he just gave a value without giving the size of the column. And earlier he had implied the columns were a certain size, but then he picked this value for this energy absorption, which was for a much thinner column. But he didn't say that. We picked it apart, and we sent a discussion paper correcting that to the Journal of Engineering Mechanics. And over 27 months, they stonewalled it and ultimately said that our discussion paper, which corrected the one they published, was out of scope, was the term they used. How can something be out of scope that corrects a published paper? It can't be out of scope. And they could not show where we were wrong. In fact, they tried to reject the paper one time with one reviewer. They had two reviewers. One begged off and wouldn't do it. So they had one reviewer, and we showed where that review was not justified at all with a rebuttal, and they had to reaccept our paper. That was in the middle of that 27 months, a year after we submitted it. In the meantime, they accepted a paper from somebody in the 9/11 Truth Movement that was probably pretty erroneous. The person tried to say the South Tower was accelerating at four times the rate of gravity, which is a little silly on its face. And they accepted that within 70 days, then had a field day showing how wrong that was. But they wouldn't publish the paper that was correcting what they actually did.
I didn't know about that other paper. That's the first I'm hearing about that. Your story is that I just want to tell us to the audience, Tony's story he's talking about is actually documented in Beyond Misinformation. It gets its own little box or graphic or whatever you call it. But you can read about that in that booklet. But this is just amazing. I mean, I've been at this a long time, and I like to think I'm pretty battle-hardened. But when you actually put it all together and look at it from above right now and just look at all of the hoops that you've had to jump through, others have had to jump through, more is coming, no doubt. It just baffles the mind.
There's clearly an attempt to suppress what we're saying. Okay, it's obvious. So, the only way you get it out there is to do what you're doing. Go to the AIA convention, apply pressure to the ASCE and this civil engineering professor, Zednik-Bazant, and tell as many people as you can. These arguments are sound. I certainly have no axe to grind. I wouldn't be saying it if there wasn't something there. And they haven't been able to refute our arguments because something else took those buildings down besides airplane hits. Certainly in the case of Building 7, a building like that doesn't go in a symmetric free fall for over 100 feet due to column 79 coming down. And when you get into their report, they can't really show that column 79 would have buckled, that it would have become laterally unsupported. They can't show that. The ARUP analysis half disproved much of what NIST said. They still went with a girder coming off the seat, but the opposite way now. But even they couldn't make the floors collapse. They also couldn't break the connections on the other girders framing into column 79. Okay, they tried to come up with a half-hearted thing that some of your listeners, engineers, might know about fracture mechanics. This Nordenson had somebody do something on fracture mechanics saying the connections, the knife brackets that were 2 foot long, they were like angles that the girders bolted to the column with. Those knife brackets were welded to the column. And they're saying when it cooled, there'd be a stress raiser. That's probably true. But in fracture mechanics, you need a lot of cycles. You're going to have a stress raisers where you have a high stress for a very short distance. Well, it's not going to completely fracture it with only a couple cycles. That's all you're going to get. You need thousands of cycles because the fatigue cracks are only on the order of 1 times 10 to the -4th or -5th each cycle. So for something to fail in fatigue like that. So it's bogus. It's not legitimate what they're saying on how the building would have failed. It just isn't. And it's sad because we're living in a fictitious reality is the way I tend to look at it. And I don't really want to live in a fictitious reality. I don't want somebody to tell me, oh yeah, that building just came down, just collapsed by fire. We heard it. I have to laugh when I hear people talk about on the internet that the firefighters heard groans and creaking, and there was a bulge on one wall. The building was each floor was a football field. I don't care if one wall was bulged. How much was the bulge? They said they put a transit on it. So it couldn't have been bulged very much. And one of the things that could have caused the bulge was just some beams expanding a little bit. That doesn't mean it's coming down.
As if there was a bulge at all. There's been no photos that you said this one.
No photos or video of this alleged bulge either. But even then, a bulge in one wall of a building that is a football field in length and width, in length, and it has the same width as a football field has. The building was 300 feet long on the long side. It was trapezoidal, but 300 feet long on the long side, like 247 feet on the shorter side, and 144 feet across. That's a football field in area, each floor. If you have a bulge all the way over 250 feet away, it's not going to matter to what's happening back, 250 feet back. It's just not. This is silly on its face, but this is the kind of things we're hearing. There was creaks and groans and just nonsense. And in addition to that, there was foreknowledge. There was an engineer that happened along, and I think he was from Rudy Giuliani's office, that told them that the building was going to collapse in 4 or 5 hours. This is 1 o'clock in the afternoon. How would he know that? When this said, and everybody really has to say, if it was fire, those circumstances couldn't come together until, shortly before it actually happened. They couldn't be foreseen that this alleged girder could be pushed or pulled off its seat, the floors would collapse, and the other girders coming into column 79 would break their connections. Column 79 would come down, the other columns behind it, the whole interior, and then the exterior. That all wouldn't come together until the last minutes. How would you know what was happening with the fire? You wouldn't know that. It's impossible to know. But this person, and NIST talks about it, Shyam Sunder, the lead investigator at NIST, talks about this engineer. He does not mention his name, but it's very curious, and that's why the firefighters, the firefighting chiefs, created an exclusion zone, and they didn't fight the fires, and for safety reasons created a safety zone around Building 7, because of this apparent engineer that we still don't, whose name we still don't have, saying the building is going to collapse. An amazing, with amazing prescience. I mean, it's just, it's silly. It's obvious they knew it was going to come down because it was going to be controlled demolition.
Well, hadn't the fires not even reached the area of collapse initiation yet?
That's exactly right, too.
So how would he even know that? Because their whole thing relies on this magic point where the laws of physics, I mean, some wonderful miracle, or I guess not wonderful miracle, however you want to look at it, supposedly caused entire steel frame high-rise to go down in 7 seconds because of a girder being pushed off its seat by some thermally expanding beams. Now, and I want to get your take on this because this is kind of unique, and this is something that I've talked about with a lot of people on the show, including Dale Pierce, who was a firefighter. Brian Maxwell, he's a firefighter over in Scotland, was just on the show last week. He's going with this campaign or angle too. But think about the firefighters who go into these high-rise buildings, right? Now, those fires that were in Building 7 were very fightable. I personally think they might have been spooked because they saw the Twin Towers get demolished.
Of course, and when this engineer said it was going to collapse, you can't blame the firefighters. They're not, the chief is right that they created exclusion zone. He's going to protect the firefighters. If somebody with some technical authority is making these prognostications, of course, the chief did the right thing, but that doesn't mean that guy was right. And when you look at it with, coming back, what's the word, hindsight, this looks very shaky.
Right, and I think that there was just a lot going on. Obviously, the lives of those firefighters are worth more than any damage these fires are going to cause in Building 7. But the point is that those fires were fightable. And so now, according to NIST, we've got this new phenomenon. Brian Maxwell calls it sudden building collapse syndrome, where if a firefighter is in a similar building fighting a fire, it's not 9/11, it's just random office fires, the building could come down in 7 seconds on their head. So now we've got a firefighter safety issue. If we want to just quit talking about controlled demolition and accept the NIST story, now we've got a major safety hazard here that for firefighters, and we should invest millions, if not billions of dollars into our high-rises to do something about this new sudden building collapse syndrome, because firefighters are in danger. What do you think about that argument?
Well, apparently the people that are involved with the International Building Code, the Uniform Building Code, did not accept NIST recommendations. They accepted very little except adding some additional fireproofing. So, NIST made all these series of recommendations to design for thermal expansion. There is some level of design for that, but they wanted much more, and none of those changes were incorporated into the building code. So that tells you right there there's something, everybody's not buying what they're selling, although it's still the official story. But the problem comes in, we showed that where they omit these items that are structurally significant, and they can't get now we're finding out the reason we never did an analysis of whether the floors collapse could cascade is NIST didn't provide an analysis. They just made an assertion. On the ARUP analysis, the engineer from Princeton, the professor, provided an analysis. He was wrong, though, okay, because he used an infinite stiffness. The takeaway is you cannot break the floor collapsing 12 foot down, cannot cause the next floor down to collapse and continue a cascading collapse. That is not possible. So, that's a new thing we found only because the ARUP analysis actually showed an analysis, and the guy was saying in there that, he was trying to be transparent. Yes, he was, but he was in error. That couldn't happen. He used a value that his value, using that infinite stiffness, he had that upper section of floor, which weighs about 46,000 pounds. He had it generating 4.133 million pounds of force on the girder below. And that's because he used an infinitely stiff point load.
Well, and you can't do that.
That's right. That's exactly right. So it's not real, and the reality is that upper floor would not collapse the lower floor. You would not have a cascade. So that's another thing that's wrong with the NIST report. The NIST report is not explanatory. It's fallacious. It does not explain the collapse at all.
Do you think this could be something that they're withholding in the input data? One of the reasons that they don't? I mean, I know it's speculation, so we want to qualify it as that, and we don't know. But just, I don't know, just thinking off the top of your head.
I don't think they ever got an analysis to do what they say. They just say it. because you can't get the finite element analysis to do what they say. We've done some of those analyses, and there's actually a full analysis being worked on right now at the University of Alaska to try to look into this, to try to arbitrate some of these questions. And there's a professor up there leading a small team of graduate students, 2 graduate students and the professor.
Right, Dr. Leroy Halsey. And actually, if our audience wants to know more about that, they can go to WTC7evaluation.org. I've run commercials for it here on this podcast. And they're doing hard work there. And, what you said, you don't even know if they even had an analysis. I mean, that would be, I'm not a lawyer, but I mean, that would be borderline criminal, because that takes it out of the realm of, they just made a mistake, too.
Well, they had an analysis, but what they did, they would remove the girder or beam by just saying it failed. Well, it may have failed stress-wise if you leave the stiffeners off the end of the girder that make it 80 times stronger than it would be without them. They took the stiffeners off. They left them out of their analysis. So then they say when they run the analysis, the stress exceeds the yield stress, it would have failed. Well, if it had all the parts on it should have had, it wouldn't have failed. So it's false.
Well, it reminds me of many years ago, I think it was one of these NBC shows like Dateline ran a story claiming that some companies' cars were exploding upon impact, and then they came to find out they had put explosives in the cars to make it happen. And they admitted it. They had to apologize as a result of a lawsuit on the program in the first couple of minutes, or I don't know when they did it, but they kind of did it and it was over and everybody forgot about it. But it kind of sounds like this. It's like you're trying to make this building come down and you're applying all of these different ways of making it happen. That's not real science.
It's like shaving points, or you're biasing the experiment towards your conclusion. That's not valid.
That is amazing. So in our last 10 or so minutes here, first of all, just jumping back to New Jersey, because we never really concluded that. How was your presentation received when you did it? Did you talk to anybody? It was in the audience afterwards? There
was a question and answer session, and people came up on the left, and actually Richard and I were both up there at that point. I gave like a little over a half-hour presentation, and his was about 15, 20 minutes. It was a discussion forum they have once a month type thing, and they advertise it in their local school paper. In the week it was done, not several weeks ahead. And, I guess there was somewhere around 12 to 15 people that asked questions. A couple professors, one professor asked, well, how was the building framed, implying that it was a tube in a tube, and I said, that's true. I said, but if you want to do the calculations on whether those stiffeners would have stopped that girder coming off, we can do them together. And he stopped talking. He didn't have any further. He didn't say any more. That stopped them from continuing on that line.
Do you feel it was overall positive?
Yeah, well, 66 out of the 70 people said they thought a new investigation was in order. There were 70 people there, and 66 of them thought a new investigation was was appropriate.
I mean, that's awesome. So it's still a success to a certain extent. They didn't cancel the whole thing. We just don't have a video of it to show anybody.
Yeah, that's the sad part, because we would have reached a lot more people than 70. And I spent, a good bit of my time, making up that presentation. And, it would have been nice to have a video of that.
Absolutely. And it gives more credibility. I mean, it happened, and we can say it happened, but it's cool to have that video circulating on YouTube, spreading around to other people, being passed around, just like Richard on C-SPAN, and experts speak out and all this. We could have added it to the arsenal for people in the activist community to show to others. So, yeah.
There may still be something. Les Jamison, they did allow, he had a portable recorder, but he hasn't put it up anywhere, and I don't know what he's done with it. And he was off. He's been worrying about these 28 pages, redacted pages. But, this is an important video. So I don't know whether you're in touch with Les Jamison or not, But if he has that on video, it should be put up on YouTube.
Well, we'll have to see about that. In the last 5 or so minutes here, engineering students, people who might have even been in your audience there at the university, they might be listening to this program now, might be interested in this. We're always trying to reach out to the young engineering students. So what do you have to say to them about this issue? Moving forward in the future, what they should do in the shadow of the big 9/11 lie regarding the buildings in New York?
Well, I think they should look into it themselves and realize that there was, there were motives, for this, and try to set the record straight themselves. I mean, I'm not going to live forever. I'll be 60 this year, so, it's not just me. I mean, the next generation has to look at this and say to themselves, if the official story is still not been officially overturned, that reality needs to be brought back front and center. We have to stop living this, it's a la la land type thing, or a fictitious reality, has to stop. And the reason for that is, if you don't know the true answers, if you're not looking at things realistically, you can't make good decisions. Good decisions are made based on the reality of the situation. If you don't have the reality of the situation, you can't make good decisions. And when you can't make solid decisions, more people are going to get hurt. And, and you also lose some of your, to the point of, civilization is harmed by it when you don't live in the real world, based on realistic situations.
That's right, and reality has a way of winning in the end, too. You can try to suppress it for a little while, but it just has a way of coming forward and winning the day. So we want to try to lessen that impact by telling the truth and acknowledging this.
That's the basis for what we're doing. I don't honestly think that we're going to get indictments. We may or may not, but regardless of whether we do, you have to put the situation, you have to explain it realistically, or you're not going to be able to move forward.
Absolutely. So we are going to keep on moving forward. I'm in this to win this. I think we will have success ultimately if we don't give up. Tony, you're not giving up. You're finding new things all the time here, so it's an honor to have you on the show always. Honored to do the webinar with you this week. Folks, watch the webinar in the archives at this point. You can see the pictures to go along with what Tony's saying. But Tony, thank you so much for coming on 9/11 Freefall.
Okay, Andy. Talk to you later.
This program is on every Thursday night on No Lies Radio at 10 o'clock Eastern, 7 o'clock Pacific. You can also keep track of the archives by going to 911freefall.com. This is Andy Steele saying have a great week and good luck.